Before The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom launched, a debate raged across social media. One side called it glorified DLC, an overpriced expansion selling for full price. The other side defended it as a legitimate sequel, worthy of its $70 cost. The controversy was so heated that, yeah, the reviews are amazing, but Tears of the Kingdom is still glorified DLC because they use the same map, became a rallying cry for critics, even as the game earned a 96 Metacritic score and universal acclaim from reviewers. This wasn't just typical pre-release skepticism. This was a fundamental question about what defines a sequel versus an expansion, and whether Nintendo was justified in charging premium price for a game that reuses the same map, characters, and many assets from Breath of the Wild. 6 years of development, 20 million copies sold, and over $1.5 billion in revenue later, that question still doesn't have a simple answer. Today, we're diving deep into the DLC debate, not to declare a winner, but to understand what the controversy reveals about modern game development, player expectations, and the blurred lines between expansions and sequels. We'll examine both sides fairly, explore what makes something DLC versus a full game, and understand why this debate matters beyond just one Zelda title. Because whether you think Tears of the Kingdom is brilliant or overpriced, the arguments on both sides tell us something important about gaming's evolution. Let's break it down. The case for it's just DLC. Let's start with the critics' perspective, because their arguments aren't baseless trolling. They raise legitimate points about value, expectations, and game development standards. The core argument is simple. If a game takes place on the same map as its predecessor and tells a story that happens after the original, many people would call it an expansion rather than a sequel. The map reuse is the most visible evidence. Tears of the Kingdom uses the exact same Hyrule overworld as Breath of the Wild. Same geography, same landmarks, same basic structure. You can navigate TOTK using BOW knowledge because you're traversing identical terrain. Critics note it's literally the same map with some cosmetic changes, arguing that true sequels should offer entirely new worlds to explore. This matters because discovery is central to Zelda's appeal. Half of BOW's magic came from encountering locations for the first time, seeing new vistas, and exploring unknown territory. When you already know where everything is, that sense of discovery evaporates. Players who spent 100+ hours in BOW felt they were retreading familiar ground rather than experiencing genuine novelty. The asset reuse extends beyond just terrain. Character models are recycled, enemy types are largely identical. Many animations, UI elements, and systems are carried over directly. The shrines follow the same format, the Koroks return with identical puzzles, village layouts are mostly unchanged. Critics argue this isn't how sequels typically work. Sequels usually build new worlds with new assets, not recycled old ones. Then there's the price. At $70, Tears of the Kingdom costs more than Breath of the Wild did at launch. For players who see the game as an iteration rather than revolution, that price increase stings. Why pay more for what feels like BOW Plus when actual DLC typically costs $20 to $30? If the content justified expansion pricing, why isn't it priced like an expansion? The historical context matters too. Producer Eiji Aonuma revealed in an interview with Kotaku that TOTK first started as a series of ideas for BOW DLC until developers realized they had more than enough new content to just make this into its own separate game. This admission fueled the controversy. The game literally originated as DLC concepts. Critics argue Nintendo took what should have been a $30 expansion, inflated it with extra content, and charged full sequel pricing. Majora's Mask offers an interesting comparison. That game also reused assets from its predecessor, Ocarina of Time, but created an entirely new world with mostly brand new characters, making the reused assets feel like something completely different rather than just more of the same. By contrast, TOTK returns to the exact same Hyrule, weakening the sense of novelty despite new mechanics. The Depths and Sky Islands, while technically new areas, face their own criticism. The depths are described as dark and massive empty areas punctuated by reskinned enemy camps and locations where you can farm certain resources with endlessly copy-pasted assets and enemies. The Sky Islands, meanwhile, allegedly suffer from repetitive design and limited variety. If the new areas themselves feel recycled, what does that say about the game's overall originality? Some players simply couldn't shake the feeling of repetition. One player stated, "It was the wrong decision for me since it was the biggest reason I bounced off of TOTK so fast. After doing 100% of the shrines in BOW a year or so earlier, it felt like I was just returning to the same world, but now I had to do it all over again." That's not a minority opinion. Many players who exhaustively completed BOW found returning to the same Hyrule exhausting rather than exciting. The DLC label also reflects disappointment about what could have been. Players imagined a true BOW sequel would take them to entirely new regions, maybe exploring lands beyond Hyrule, visiting other kingdoms, or experiencing completely different environments. Instead, they got the same place they'd already spent hundreds of hours exploring. The map reuse represents missed opportunity for something genuinely fresh. The case for it's a full sequel. Now let's examine the other side, because Tears of the Kingdom's defenders have equally compelling arguments about what constitutes a sequel and why Tears of the Kingdom deserve that designation. The fundamental counter-argument is that content volume, mechanical innovation, and creative freedom define sequels more than new geography does. Start with the raw content edition. Tears of the Kingdom doesn't just reuse BOW's map, it adds two entirely new layers. The Sky Islands create an archipelago above Hyrule spanning the entire map. The Depths create an inverse underground world matching Hyrule's surface geography. Together with the modified surface, TOTK's playable area is substantially larger than BOW's, with changes so significant that it feels like a whole new world. That's not DLC-scale content. That's building two additional game worlds on top of an existing foundation. The mechanical innovations completely transform gameplay. Ultra Hand, Fuse, Ascend, and Recall aren't minor ability additions, they're fundamental systems that change how you interact with everything. The crafting in Tears of the Kingdom changes how players go through the game at a core level, making it more important to craft the right weapons for the right job rather than just finding powerful weapons like in BOTW. These aren't tweaks, they're revolutionary mechanics that enable emergent gameplay impossible in BOTW. The building system alone justifies sequel status. Director Hidemaru Fujibayashi revealed that players are making vehicles and creations that are far beyond what we had expected, so we are really amazed at the imagination of our players. This isn't a gimmick added to familiar gameplay, it's a fundamental reimagining of what you can do in Hyrule. You're not just exploring spaces, you're creating solutions, building vehicles, and solving problems in ways BOTW never allowed. Asset reuse isn't laziness, it's efficient development that enables innovation elsewhere. Reusing Hyrule is indicative not of laziness, but of confidence in the assets themselves, with the clear benefit being that the majority of Hyrule was already built and established in Breath of the Wild, allowing developers to focus on 3 complete, fully realized levels to the world. If building a new map required another 3 years of development, we'd lose the Sky Islands, the Depths, or the elaborate physics systems. Asset reuse enabled more ambitious innovation. The definition of sequel matters here. If sequels require entirely new settings, then Majora's Mask isn't a true sequel, despite reusing OOT assets. Neither is Uncharted 2, which reused many systems from Uncharted 1, or any Call of Duty sequel, which iterates on existing frameworks. The standard that if the game takes place after the events of BOTW and tells its own contained story, then it's a sequel is perfectly reasonable. Narrative continuation and mechanical evolution define sequels, not wholesale asset replacement. The game's completeness and polish counter the DLC criticism. TOTK spent an entire extra year in development just polishing the game to make sure it ran smoothly with the least amount of bugs as possible, resulting in a near-flawless release, a rarity in modern gaming. That level of refinement reflects sequel-scale development, not DLC expansion. The game launched feature-complete with no day-one patches, no content roadmaps, no planned expansions. That's a finished product, not an add-on. Player creativity validates the mechanical depth. The viral videos of elaborate machines, creative puzzle solutions, and unexpected interactions demonstrate that TOTK systems enable possibilities far beyond BOTW's capabilities. This isn't more of the same, it's fundamentally different gameplay wearing familiar settings. The map may be the same, but what you can do in that map is revolutionary. Nintendo's explicit statement that we were able to implement all of the elements that we wanted to achieve in this world and this story, so there will be no any DLC, reinforces that this is a complete vision, not an expansion.
The developers put everything they wanted into the base game, treating it as a comprehensive work rather than a foundation for future monetization. The game's critical and commercial success suggests players agree it's a full sequel. 20 million copies sold at $70 equals $1.4 billion in revenue. Players bought the game enthusiastically despite criticism, demonstrating that perceived value exceeded price resistance. Nintendo correctly calculated that Zelda fans would pay premium prices for premium content regardless of map reuse. What actually defines DLC versus sequels? This controversy exposes a fundamental ambiguity in gaming terminology. What's the actual difference between a large expansion and a small sequel? The industry has no clear standard, and that ambiguity creates space for legitimate disagreement. Historically, expansions added content to existing games. New missions, areas, or features integrated into the base game. You needed the original to play them. They cost significantly less than full games, typically $20 to $40. They reused the base game's systems and assets extensively while adding new content on top. Sequels traditionally were standalone products, new stories, new settings, built from scratch experiences that didn't require predecessors. They cost full price because they represented complete new games, not additions to existing ones. But modern game development has blurred these definitions. Spider-Man Miles Morales reuses Spider-Man PS4's New York, but is considered a standalone game. Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon uses Far Cry 3's mechanics, but is a separate product. Uncharted Lost Legacy reuses Uncharted 4's engine and assets, but isn't called DLC. These expandalone games, combining expansion and standalone, keep a lot of elements from the game they're based on, but also add enough content to make it an entire game by themselves. Tears of the Kingdom fits this expandalone category perfectly. It builds on BOTW's foundation, but adds sufficient content and innovation to stand alone. The question isn't whether it's technically DLC or sequel, it's whether the expandalone approach justified $70 pricing and 6 years of development. The answer depends on what you value. If you prioritize exploration of new environments and visual novelty, TOTK disappoints. You're retreading familiar ground despite new mechanics. If you prioritize mechanical depth and creative freedom, TOTK excels. The same environments enable entirely different experiences through revolutionary systems. Neither perspective is wrong. They simply value different aspects of game design. The DLC debate isn't about objective truth. It's about subjective priorities, and those priorities vary legitimately among players. The price problem. Is $70 justified? The $70 price point is where the controversy intensifies because price creates explicit value comparisons. Is this game worth as much as God of War Ragnarok, which built entirely new realms? Is it worth more than BOTW itself cost at launch? Does mechanical innovation justify the same pricing as games with new assets, settings, and characters? From Nintendo's perspective, the pricing is straightforward. Development costs were equivalent to creating a new game. The team worked for 6 years creating 3 layers of world, revolutionary mechanics, extensive content, and flawless polish. Labor and development expenses match or exceed typical AAA budgets. Therefore, AAA pricing is justified. The market validated this pricing. 20 million copies at $70 equals $1.4 billion in revenue. Players bought the game enthusiastically despite criticism, demonstrating that perceived value exceeded price resistance. Nintendo correctly calculated that Zelda fans would pay premium prices for premium content regardless of map reuse.
But perceived value isn't universal. Players who bounced off the game after 20 hours because it felt too similar to BOTW paid $70 for an experience that didn't satisfy them. Those players legitimately feel they overpaid for what amounts to an expensive expansion. The game's value depends entirely on how much you personally enjoy the mechanical innovations versus how much you're bothered by the recycled setting. Compare TOTK to actual DLC models. The Witcher 3's Blood and Wine expansion added 30-plus hours of content in an entirely new region for $20. Elden Ring's Shadow of the Erdtree offered massive new areas and content for $40. Both provided genuinely new environments at expansion pricing. TOTK offers more content than these expansions, but in a recycled setting at full game pricing. Which model offers better value? The counter-argument is that TOTK doesn't require BOTW to play, making it a standalone product worth standalone pricing. Expansions require base games, sequels don't. By that definition alone, TOTK deserves sequel pricing regardless of asset reuse.
Ultimately, the price controversy reveals different consumer expectations. Some players expect full-price games to be built from scratch with entirely new assets. Others accept that asset reuse is industry-standard practice that enables better games through efficient development. Both perspectives are reasonable, creating legitimately different value assessments for the same product. The technical reality of asset reuse. The lazy criticism of asset reuse fundamentally misunderstands game development. Creating a AAA open-world game from scratch requires 5 to 7 years and costs hundreds of millions of dollars. Asset reuse is how studios deliver quality games in reasonable timeframes without going bankrupt. Creating a video game takes a ton of time, effort, and money, with even the tiniest details coming under scrutiny and going through phases of feedback and iteration. If you can take a shortcut through asset reuse, you should. This isn't cutting corners, it's intelligent resource allocation that lets developers focus on innovation rather than rebuilding identical systems. The Yakuza series exemplifies smart asset reuse. Every Yakuza game takes place in Kamurocho, with the city becoming basically a character in itself, with locations and set pieces that are reused between games, evoking familiarity and giving the series that important constant, while allowing Sega to experiment more with innovative game mechanics and new directions. No one calls Yakuza games lazy for reusing their setting because the reuse enables genre experimentation and mechanical innovation. TOTK follows this philosophy. Reusing Hyrule Surface freed resources to build the Sky Islands, the Depths, the Ultra Hand system, the advanced physics engine, and the seamless vertical traversal. Asset reuse allowed the creativity to flow elsewhere, expanding the world of Hyrule substantially and making the game far more impressive as a result. Without that reuse, we'd get either a smaller game or wait another 3 years for release. Modern game development increasingly embraces asset reuse because games have become prohibitively expensive to build from scratch. Horizon Forbidden West reused many systems from Zero Dawn. Spider-Man 2 built on Spider-Man PS4's foundation. God of War Ragnarok evolved God of War 2018's framework. This isn't laziness, it's how AAA games survive economically while still innovating meaningfully. The criticism isn't really about asset reuse itself, it's about whether the reuse is obvious enough to break immersion. When asset reuse is invisible or justified contextually, players don't complain. When it's obvious and feels like corner cutting, players rebel. TOTK's crime is making the reuse too visible by returning to the exact same map players had already explored exhaustively. What players actually wanted. The controversy reveals a disconnect between what Nintendo delivered and what many players hoped for. The dream sequel wasn't Hyrule with new mechanics, it was entirely new lands to explore, new civilizations, new mysteries. Players wanted to explore regions only mentioned in BOTW lore. They wanted to leave Hyrule and adventure in foreign kingdoms. They wanted the scope expansion that new geography provides. Some fans expressed this directly. I'd rather have a whole new land to explore than kinda different Hyrule, noting disappointment that, despite loving Zelda, the map reuse reduced excitement for the sequel. The desire for novelty through new settings is legitimate and widespread. The Sky Islands and the Depths were compromise solutions, but they didn't fully satisfy players craving genuine geographical novelty. Critics note, I was so disappointed that the Sky Islands ended up just being so similar to one another, and the Depths really could have used more content that was less repetitive. These additions provided new areas without delivering the sense of discovery players wanted. Some players who loved TOTK explicitly valued returning to Hyrule. One fan said, returning to have another adventure here in Breath of the Wild's Hyrule was the biggest draw of the game for me, and added, I really loved revisiting this Hyrule. For these players, familiarity was feature, not bug. They wanted more time in a world they loved, and TOTK delivered exactly that. This split reveals that no single approach satisfies everyone. New settings disappoint players who wanted to return to BOTW's Hyrule. Reuse settings disappoint players who wanted fresh environments. Nintendo chose to satisfy the latter group while innovating mechanically to justify the choice. That decision created the controversy, but it also enabled the game's mechanical ambitions. The question becomes, was it worth it? Did the mechanical innovations enabled by asset reuse create sufficient value to offset the familiarity? For millions of players who love the building and creative freedom, absolutely. For players who value exploration and discovery over mechanical depth, probably not. The aftermath. Did the debate matter? With hindsight, we can assess whether the pre-release controversy had merit or was just noise that evaporated on contact with the game. The sales and critical reception suggest most players sided with the full sequel perspective, but the debate itself revealed important tensions in modern game development. Following release, those calling TOTK glorified DLC all but vanished in place of fans calling it the greatest game ever made and the game of the year. The game's quality silenced most critics, proving that execution matters more than asset reuse. When the game works brilliantly, players forgive the recycled setting. But some players' experiences validated the DLC criticism. Players who bounced off of TOTK so fast after doing 100% of the shrines in Breath of the Wild a year or so earlier found the similarity exhausting rather than comfortable. These players aren't wrong or invalid, they had legitimate expectations that the game didn't meet, and their disappointment is real regardless of the game's overall success.
The commercial success doesn't invalidate criticism, it shows that a substantial market accepted the approach while another segment remained dissatisfied. TOTK is simultaneously one of the most successful games ever made and a disappointment to certain players. Both things are true. The debate also revealed that players have no consensus on what makes something DLC versus sequel. Definitions vary wildly based on personal priorities. Some define sequels by asset reuse, others by narrative continuation, others by mechanical innovation, others by content volume. None of these definitions is objectively correct, making the debate inherently subjective and unresolvable. Nintendo's statement that there will be no TOTK DLC because they'd done everything in this incarnation of Hyrule suggests the developers see this as a complete work that exhausted the setting's possibilities. If this is truly everything they wanted to do with this Hyrule, then the completeness justifies sequel status and pricing, whether that setting was recycled or not. The industry implications. The Tears of the Kingdom debate matters beyond one game because it tests player tolerance for asset reuse in $70 games. Will players accept sequels that reuse settings if mechanical innovations justify it? Or do premium prices require premium novelty in all aspects? The answer seems to be, it depends on execution and context. TOTK succeeded despite map reuse because the mechanical innovations were revolutionary, the new content was substantial, and the polish was impeccable. A lesser game with the same approach would face harsher criticism. Quality buys forgiveness. But the controversy also signals that asset reuse has limits. Players will tolerate, even celebrate, reuse settings if compensated with sufficient innovation elsewhere, but tolerance isn't infinite. If the next Zelda game reused TOTK's Hyrule again, even with new mechanics, backlash would be severe. Familiarity breeds contempt when pushed too far. The debate also highlights generational differences in expectations. Younger players who grew up with frequent sequels and DLC expansions see asset reuse as normal. Older players who remember when sequels meant entirely new games view reuse as cutting corners. These different baselines create incompatible standards that guarantee ongoing debate. Spider-Man 2 faced similar criticism for reusing Spider-Man PS4's New York City, proving this isn't Zelda-specific. As games become more expensive to develop, asset reuse will become more common, and these debates will intensify. The industry needs clearer language to differentiate between expansions, expandalones, and full sequels, or accept that these categories have blurred permanently. The final verdict. So is Tears of the Kingdom just glorified DLC? The honest answer is, it depends what you mean by just, and what you mean by DLC. If DLC means content that reuses existing assets and settings, then yes, TOTK is technically DLC-like in its approach to the setting. The map reuse is undeniable, and that's a legitimate point of criticism for players who expected entirely new environments to explore. If DLC means supplementary content that lacks the scope and innovation of a full sequel, then no, TOTK is absolutely a full sequel. The mechanical innovations, content volume, development scope, and creative ambition all exceed what we typically call DLC by enormous margins. The controversy was never really about objective categorization. It was about value perception and priorities. Players who value mechanical innovation and creative freedom see TOTK as an exceptional sequel that innovated boldly. Players who value environmental novelty and exploration see it as an overpriced expansion wearing sequel clothing. Both groups are evaluating the same game honestly based on different criteria. What we can say definitively, Tears of the Kingdom is not traditional DLC by any reasonable definition. It's a standalone product with revolutionary mechanics, enormous content, and complete independence from its predecessor. It's also not a traditional sequel that builds entirely new settings and assets. It occupies the middle ground, the expandalone space, where modern game development increasingly lives.
Whether that approach justified $70 in 6 years of development is subjective. The market said yes with $1.5 billion in sales. Many individual players said no by bouncing off early or avoiding purchase entirely. There's no objective truth here, just different perspectives on value that depend on what aspects of game design matter most to you personally. The real lesson is that asset reuse is neither automatically good nor automatically bad. It's a development strategy that enables certain kinds of innovation while sacrificing certain types of novelty. TOTK used asset reuse brilliantly to enable mechanical revolution, creating one of gaming's most creative and successful titles. But that brilliance doesn't erase the legitimate disappointment of players who wanted completely new worlds to explore. So was TOTK just DLC? No. Was it everything players hoped for in a sequel? Also no. It was something in between, a revolutionary mechanical evolution in a familiar setting, an expandalone that proved asset reuse can enable innovation without being lazy, and a $70 experiment that succeeded commercially while leaving some players wishing it had taken different risks. That's the truth about Tears of the Kingdom. It's too innovative to be dismissed as DLC, too familiar to be celebrated as a revolutionary sequel, and too successful to be called a mistake, but also too divisive to claim universal approval. It's a brilliant, flawed, ambitious, safe, revolutionary, recycled masterpiece that somehow managed to be all of those contradictory things simultaneously. And maybe that's the most Nintendo thing about it.